Assalamu alaikum. I am Fakih Hamzat from Events Department of LUMS Religious Society. Today, LRS, in collaboration with Psychology at LUMS, brings the topic of growing up in toxic households, road to recovery, in to you guys. Dr. Yousuf Raza, the founder and CEO of telepsychiatry.pk, a self-aware online mental health platform, will be joining us today. He has a degree in medicine, a specialization in psychiatry, a master's in psychology, and is an academic associate in Franklian logotherapy. He is known for his inspirational talks, workshops oriented around worldly wide optimism rooted in the works of Viktor Frankl, Charles Peirce, and Allama Iqbal. Through the course of this discussion, Dr. Yousuf Raza will be helping us understand the meaning of toxicity and why our households are toxic anyway. He will be guiding us on how we can gain immunity against the toxicity and recover from it. Now, I would like to request Dr. Yousuf Raza to take the lead in this talk and enlighten us as to whether life is supposed to be sweet as honey or if it is like a lemonade, sweet and sour but worth relishing. Thank you.
Okay. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I do not know if I'm going to be able to interact with all of you. StreamYard is usually not very helpful with respect to interaction. So I'm guessing this is going to be pretty much a monologue for the next half hour or so. If you guys can give me a heads up with respect to the time that we're looking for, we're looking at how long do you want me to go on before the Q&A? And I will manage accordingly. All right, if there's anybody, I do see a comments section. Okay, so there are people can respond, or people can at least type something in the comments and I'll be able to read it. All right, so toxic households. Let's be very clear on what we mean by toxicity, right? There will be those elements within our households which will be genuinely toxic, okay? And by genuinely toxic, I mean those elements which are which do not promote our growth the way our growth is supposed to be promoted. Our individuality, our ability to realize our potential, our meaning that we have in life, to be able to see it, to be able to achieve it, live it, right? Anything that takes us away from that would be toxic. And the further away it takes us from that potential, the more toxic it's going to be. Okay? Now, there will be those things which are outright toxic. And when we talk about childhood abuse, there are many forms of abuse. And this doesn't necessarily have to be childhood. It can start from childhood. It can even start from when we're babies and go on until the teenage. Because let's face it, we are pretty much dependent into our late 20s and early 30s, right? That's just how we roll. Independence in having our own place or living separately from those households is quite a tall ask, and it takes a lot of doing to achieve that. So in any case, anything that qualifies as abusive will necessarily be toxic. And what qualifies as abuse? There's different forms of abuse as defined by the WHO. What kind of abuses are those? we all know of the more popular kinds: physical abuse. Okay. Somebody who is being physically reprimanded repeatedly. Somebody who is subjected to emotional abuse. Okay. Somebody who is subjected to sexual abuse. It doesn't necessarily have to be on part of the parents, from the parents, right? It can be from anywhere. It can be elder siblings. It can be at school. And then, of course, there's sexual abuse of various kinds. And sexual abuse, the perpetrators would usually not be parents, but they would usually be relatives. The toxicity on the part of the household would be such it is creating an environment in which that kind of abuse has become possible, right? And typically there would be neglect. There doesn't have to be neglect, but a lot of times there would be neglect, and neglect is another form of abuse. Okay. So all of these different forms of abuse, there are love needs that a child has, that a teenager has, that every adult has. If those love needs are not fulfilled, then that would result in neglect. Okay, so be very clear on this point. When I say neglect, I don't just mean neglecting the physical needs of the child, the nutrition, the shelter, the clothes, etc. Neglect would be far wider than that. My focus here being on the love needs of the child and the teenager and the adult, for that matter. Okay, so all of these different forms of abuse would be toxic, would be taking that individual person further and further away from realizing their meaning, from realizing their potential, from actualizing themselves. And that's unfortunately fairly common, unfortunately very prevalent. We have to be aware of that. Beyond this, moving further from this, there's also a perception of toxicity. Okay, so for example, there may well be somebody who's pretty all right with how they grew up in their household, and then all of a sudden they hear somebody like me talk, giving the different forms of abuse, and they're like, oh my God, I was actually abused. I was neglected. I was reprimanded emotionally. That qualifies as emotional abuse, doesn't it? So I was abused there as well. And this is something that is becoming more and more common, that our perception of toxicity is also going to result in us not being able to actualize, us not being able to live up to our potentials. Okay, so there's that problem. One, like I said, actual genuine toxicity, but then two, a perception of toxicity. And that perception of toxicity, if it is compounded by, made worse by, a perception of or an understanding that, oh my God, I grew up in a toxic environment. I have been permanently damaged. My capacity to grow, actualize myself, has been seriously broken. And that's that. I am stuck with it. This is how I have now been fated to live by my parents or by my family or by my teachers for that matter, or by God or by society, whatever. And so I am the way I am because of this toxicity. So that's it. That justifies any toxicity that emanates from me. Okay? These are different levels of the problem that we're going to look to talk about today. Okay? I really feel like I'm talking to myself here. I don't see any. I hope there's people listening, but I'm going to go on nevertheless. Okay. With that out of the way, I hope we're clear on the different aspects that I highlighted. There's genuine toxicity, and then there is a perception of toxicity. And the perception of toxicity is growing more and more as we speak, right? Because there is an increasing awareness, and the awareness is good. That's what we're doing over here, right? That's what I'm here for, to raise awareness on this issue. But sometimes we overdo it. Sometimes we raise so much awareness that people perceive toxicity for when there wasn't much toxicity to begin with. So we have to be really careful there. Nevertheless, your perception does count, and your perception does have to be addressed, because if a child perceived, even if there was no neglect, but a child perceived neglect, that will influence how the child grows up. That will influence the personality that is developing. That will influence that manifestation of that potential, whether or not it's going to take place or not. Okay, so we have to be very clear on that. Now, where does this come from? Why are our households toxic? How can your parents, who are so loving, and we would believe by default that most parents, majority of the parents, are loving. Now, there is a minority who would not be loving. That minority may be negligible as far as statistics go. It is very significant for me as a psychiatrist, because then there's individuals that end up with me on account of those non-loving parents, evil parents, even antisocial parents. But nevertheless, the vast majority are loving parents. How is it that their love fails to get communicated? It fails to protect their children from all these various forms of abuse, and they themselves become the sources of toxicity. How does that happen? Number one, ignorance, not knowing, not realizing. See, you don't have to educate people about physical needs. You don't have to raise awareness. Your children need food. Your children need water. Your children need education. For the most part, we don't have to do that. Yes, bits and pieces of information do have to be put out there. Your children have calcium needs. Your children have iron needs. They may be suffering from iron deficiency. That really wonderful awareness campaign that Shahzad Roy was a part of, if he was not actually spearheading it, I'm not sure, in which children are being told all these different symptoms are being shown, and then it's being highlighted that these are all symptoms of iron deficiency. And I think that was iron deficiency, that it's because of that all of those symptoms are coming around. The child has learning difficulties, the child is slow, is not socially participating, is not active. Guess what? Those can all be manifestations of depression in children as well. And that's probably more common than iron deficiency. One reason why we miss out on real signs of depression, anxiety, or behavioral problems in children uh, who are living in toxic households, and we think everything is okay and that there's no problem, is because the way depression manifests itself, the way anxiety manifests itself, the way toxicity manifests itself in children is very different from how it manifests itself in adults. So most of the presentations that advertisement showed, learning difficulties, behavioral problems, tantrum issues. I don't know if actually tantrum issues were covered or not. I don't think if they were, but learning difficulties, socializing difficulties, and not being very active in sports, etc. Those can all be because of depression. Those could all be because of depression. And of course, in adults, you don't really see that. You don't really see that. Academic difficulties would not be related with directly with depression. We would see depression as sadness, as being as weeping spells. Children don't necessarily express their depression like that. They don't have that. There's the emotional expression hasn't developed as such. In any case, so there's ignorance that children have these needs, that children have these emotional needs. There is ignorance as to how prevalent sexual abuse is. There is ignorance that this way of parenting, in which we are constantly criticizing, in which we are, for some reason, holding back all kinds of appreciation, encouragement, and positive regard, this kind of parenting is it's leading to emotional abuse. There is ignorance. There is ignorance on that. There is ignorance that children do not perceive. They don't have the intellectual capacity to perceive that you working, making money, providing them shelter, providing them clothes, providing them food, providing them an education, in the mind of the child, or rather in the heart of the child, that doesn't qualify as love. They're not economically minded like that. We are, as adults, we think in terms of money. We think in terms of our, oh my God, all the work that I do, earning all of this money for this family is an expression of my love. And it is an expression of your love, but it is not perceived by the children as an expression of love. They don't know what work is. They don't know what going out and getting a job and, having to do whatever it is that you do from 9 to 5 or your businesses. They don't know what that means. They don't know what it means to stand up in the kitchen all day. They don't know what sleepless nights, changing diapers, feeding a child, worrying about their clothes. They don't know what that means. They don't know how difficult that is. Their ability to understand that it develops far later than we as adults appreciate. They understand appreciation, encouragement, smile, hug, kiss, high fives, pat on the back, ruffling their hair, play wrestling, spending quality time with them, giving them gifts when they don't have to literally, throw tantrum after tantrum after tantrum to actually finally get whatever it is that they so desperately wanted. They don't, that just when a gift comes, when they don't ask for it, that signifies to them love. When you do something for them, that signifies for them love. Okay, so the ignorance surrounding all of that was what qualifies, that results in toxicity. That results in all of those different forms of abuse coming around. Further, untreated personality issues, unidentified personality issues in the parents, unidentified, untreated depression in the parents results in toxic households. That even if they are aware as to what qualifies as love for children, their capacity to express that is compromised on account of psychological challenges, problems, and illnesses that are not being addressed. So a depressed mother or a depressed father is going to almost naturally result in a toxic household. That's going to be taken out. Short of expressing the love needs or fulfilling the love needs of the child, it is quite possible that undue aggression, unwarranted anger, where your personality issues are so unprocessed that the children are blamed for being inherently flawed or malevolent or evil. I've seen that in my whatever child psychiatry cases we do get to see, in mothers bringing in their children and then constantly opening up this litany of accusations again. Ever since he's been born, he's been this, he's been that, he couldn't do this, he doesn't do this, he deliberately does this. He's 5 years old. But the whole the litany of accusations, it's like, you know, a criminal charge sheet. Anywho, that I would literally do this. I would ask a relative of the child or whoever was with the mother, an elder sibling or whatever, please take the child outside. I need to speak to the parent. The parent needs help before the child needs help. The parent requires coaching. Anyway, so there's all of that. Toxicity emanates from there. Toxicity emanates from interparental conflict, where parents are constantly at each other, never getting along, always fighting, where women are encouraged to stay in abusive relationships for the absolute demonization of divorce. And children have to see their mothers getting physically, verbally abused day in and day out. That results in toxicity. That results in a depressed mother. That results in neglected children right there. So that interparental conflict, that too will have its own, the ignorance that underpins that. We all know there is no shortage of awareness with respect to how much investment is required on a wedding, in terms of money, in terms of how many. There was this really huge wedding that was on the news even. I forget whose it was, but you guys, some of you know what I'm talking about, as to how many millions were just thrown around. Fair enough. Was the marriage invested in? Does the couple have any idea about what love is beyond what they learned from Bollywood, or worse, Star Plus, or worse, Hum TV? I don't know which is worse, actually. I haven't seen either one. But you know what I mean. If their understanding of love and relationships, of men, of women, emanates from electronic media, or worse, social media, if Facebook statuses is what has informed them of what it means to make a relationship work, oh my God, that's not investment in a marriage. So it doesn't matter how much you've invested in the wedding, there will be conflict. There should be conflict. Every good relationship has conflict. But then not knowing what to make of that conflict, not knowing how to curtail that conflict, not knowing how to positively channel that conflict, that ignorance is going to result in a constant interparental, not just conflict, chaos. And that's where toxicity will emanate from. And a lot of these toxic encounters are something that the parents, the unprocessed personalities, the depression, the abuse, they've been carrying that from their own parents. They've been carrying that from their own toxic households. And really, some of the families that which is why I say pathologies are usually not in individuals, they're in families, entire families of pathological toxic behavior, where one grandmother, who was also a mother-in-law, very problematic personality, and you see how far the toxicity reached. Incredibly mind-boggling. All children, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, grandchildren manifesting borderline personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, antisocial. Oof. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. And you see the common link. Where did it come from? Oof. So ignorance with respect to all of that. So just carrying this forward, that's where toxicity comes from. That's where toxic households come from. But what this is compounded by, and that's the most important point that I want you to take away from here, that growing up in toxic households has not condemned you for life. We've all had our share of toxicity. The best of parents will not have been able to help putting out at least some level of toxicity. It's only natural. It's only natural. We've defined it so, we've given such a difficult definition of it that to actually have not experienced it would be a wonder. Right? And then even those who have not experienced it, when they go out in the real world and then face the toxicity, they're usually ill-prepared. They have had like the time of their lives with absolutely Times Magazine Parents of the Year kind of parents. And when they're like going to college, when they're done with high school, oof, reality strikes. Friends who have actually grown up in toxic households bring that toxicity to campus. And then what they experience, just toxic teachers. And these are people who've never really seen toxicity in their lives. And like, where did this come from? Where did this come from? Or they get married into toxic households. And there's so many people that I've interacted with, daughters-in-law usually. And they're like, in our households, we didn't really have those kinds of fights. And in this new household that I'm my husband's family, these people are like abusing and cursing at each other and all kinds of threats. And within a couple of hours, they're okay. And I'm like traumatized for a week. That's just it. That's how resilient they've become, because they've grown up. And that's just become a habit of encounter for them, habit of interaction for them. So that there's difficulty in managing that. Anyways, my point is that we as psychologists, psychiatrists, trying to create awareness, somehow come out giving this impression that you're done for, you're doomed, you're condemned, there's nothing that can be done. You're determined now, you are fated with these neurochemicals in your brain, and conflicts in your unconscious and your psyche, that there is nothing you can do about them anymore, and you're going to be a wreck of a personality yourself forever and ever, or depressed forever and ever, and that's just how it is. The best that you can do is be on these medications or just take therapy for life. Okay? I want to take a very, very strong stance against that notion that our awareness campaigns inevitably lead to. That is not true. No matter how toxic the household, no matter how difficult the circumstances that you've grown up in or that you've landed yourself in, there is one dimension to you as a human being which is so sacred, which is so human, that nothing can take that away from you, and that is your freedom. That is your freedom. And that allows you to take a stand. That allows you to say, enough. I am not going to become a conduit for this toxicity anymore. I am not going to allow this toxicity, which has been in my family for generations now. I am not going to pass. This is not a family heirloom, an inheritance that I'm going to pass on to my future generation. It stops with me. It stops with me. I'm going to take a stand against it. I am going to be different. And a lot of people are. A lot of people end up being wonderful parents. Wonderful parents. Because they didn't have wonderful parents. They didn't have wonderful parents. A lot of people end up being incredible figures in society and are more prone to actualizing their inner potential, their social potential, their intellectual potential, their spiritual potential, precisely because of toxic experiences. And they take those stands. It's difficult, but it is not impossible. Past influences are present very strongly, very heavily, but does not determine it, does not cause it. Our freedom is sacred. Our freedom is what makes us human. Our freedom is what makes us unique. Our freedom needs to be developed further. Our freedom needs to be strengthened so that I'll be honest with you, for a lot of us, the journey of exercising that freedom against our childhood and teenage experiences is lifelong, is very difficult, but never impossible. Some of the greatest people in the world, the greatest gifts that they've given humanity, they've had troubled childhoods. They've had difficulties growing up. Yet they were able to process all of that. They were able to curtail that. It begins with acknowledgement. It begins with a recognition. And it continues to bring out from that personality something that without those toxic experiences would not have been possible. It's very paradoxical. It's very shocking, really, that there are aspects to our personality and what we can give to society that would not have been possible had we not had those intense emotional experiences. A lot of the times people are capable of intense spiritual experiences and spiritual actions and social contributions precisely because of the depth or intensity of their traumatic childhood experiences. We have living examples. We have living examples. And before I move on to the question and answer session, I do want to make one additional point, that in making lemonade of the lemons that life gave us, or something resembling lemonade for This Is Us fans, in making that lemonade, there's one important step, and that is to be able to see the love of your parents, the sacrifice of your parents, and be able to respect them, to be able to express that gratitude towards them, even if some toxicity emanated from them, to be able to mature emotionally in being able to see that a source from where a lot of difficulty, suffering, and toxicity came can be the same source from which everything I owe of my existence, for my existence, also came, one at the same time. It is an incredible crisis of growing up, of becoming an adult, that is to deal with this ambivalence in ourselves when it comes to our parents. To one extreme, we place them on a pedestal as idols who can do no wrong. To another extreme, we look at them as nothing less than the devil who can do no good. And either one of those extremes is extremely problematic. To be able to develop that incisiveness at an emotional level, and to develop it at the emotional level requires for us to comprehend it at an intellectual level. That good, a lot of good, that deserves our gratitude can come from a source that something possibly unforgivable has also emanated from. So with that, I close. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak on this. And yeah, if you have any questions, I will be happy to respond if I can. Over to you, people. Yeah, you can give your feedback here too. I'd like to know. I don't know how many people I was able to put to sleep at this time of day after having taken like session after session after session of toxic households. I do tend to be more and more soporific. Okay, there's so many questions. How do you limit the influence of very close toxic family members on your life, since any attempts to make them understand anything goes into vain and is seen as disobeying them? This does not mean that you don't love or respect them, but you are able to recognize that there are some toxic traits that end up doing a lot of harm. See, when it comes to dealing with active toxicity, so obviously we've grown in our toxic households and now we're out of it. We have to deal with it actively. I do believe that as adults, it is an incredible blessing if the sources of our toxicity are alive. Okay? Because then that maturity that I alluded to towards the end of my talk you can develop that with the person himself. That wherever those internal personality conflicts, whoever sowed the seeds for those conflicts is actually alive and well for you to have reasonable discussion with as an adult, then nothing like that. There's only so much of it that we can simulate in therapy, right? Um, then nothing like that. Yes, to be able to have that conversation may not always be possible. It may well be that any attempt at having a conversation will result in more toxicity. And then you really have to make the call that, do I invest myself emotionally, spiritually into this sort of reconciliation, or are my efforts better expended somewhere else? Okay, so that you have to make that call depending on how your parents respond. And to be honest, a lot of the people that I've worked with, they always come up with a gut instinctive reaction when I suggest this. But then, as the conversation proceeds and they agree to attempt something along the lines of what I'm suggesting, they come back with a lot of a very positive response. That, okay, I did initiate that conversation with him, and to my surprise, he was actually very open, or she was actually very open to listening to me. I was shocked, right? And of course, how that's going to be done, how that conversation is going to take place, or in an individual's case, should that conversation take place or not, is not, you can't give a generic response to that. It's on a case-to-case. Individuals have to make that judgment on their own. And so through a conversation, otherwise you settle that this is one of the aspects of who they are. I don't have the capacity to change it. I don't know where it's coming from in them. Is it deliberate? Is it something they could control, they could not control? That's not my call. That's not my judgment. I know where my freedom is. I know not to do that myself. But for them, can I create an excuse? Can I find a justification? Or if I can't find a justification, can I just let it be and continue relating with the non-toxic aspects of my parents? Why not? Why not? And to be diplomatic, I guess, with the ones that you feel you don't have the capacity to positively influence. Okay. I hope that somewhat addresses that question, Zainab. And moving on. If anxiety is linked to an intuitive feeling, premonition, that something is not right, does medication help? See, should medication help at that time? If it is genuinely intuitive and it's pointing in the right direction, it is making you aware of, if it's making you aware of something that needs to be fixed. Ideally, the effort should be channeled in finding out what that something is and how that something can be fixed. I like to use the analogy, whether it's stress, anxiety, or depression, of a fire alarm. The fire alarm is telling you that there's a fire. Okay? Find where that fire is, put it out. A medication, what that would do is it'll tell you to turn the fire alarm off. The medication acts directly on the fire alarm. Now, there will be situations in which the fire alarm is so loud that it is really debilitating, and you really can't find the source of the fire just because of how loud the fire alarm is. Obviously, the analogy becomes absurd at this point, but it communicates the message. In those situations, yes, medications, if they can tone that down, the search for the fire continues. Please remember, turning off the fire alarm has not taken care of the fire. So maybe the depression is gone, maybe the anxiety is gone, but the fire is still there. Okay, so I hope that helps. Okay. Guilt of not being able to fix many things that are somehow beyond that control. How do you really separate yourself from the situation you are coming from? See, separating yourself from the situation you're coming from is your individuality developing, you becoming an individual. And it is important to become an individual. It is important. That's where your freedom is called for. If your capacity as a human being, your spiritual capacity as a human being, allows for you to see yourself distinct from the situation that you came from, then it also allows you to identify what it would mean to act differently and do something else. And in doing something else, you're becoming a different individual. So if my environment, my upbringing, my inner conflicts are instigating me and overwhelming me emotionally to yell, to scream, to take it out on my kids, but I take a step back, look at that anger, control it, keep it in check, then now I am growing as an individual distinct from my environment. Carrying that within me, yes, possibly even channeling that in the right direction. Possibly channeling, again, This Is Us fans, if there are any. Jack, his father, his upbringing, and how he looks to completely turn that around when he's a father, and how it affects generations. Okay. The guilt. See, again, this is something that we need to exercise with ourselves. Distinguish the kind of guilt that we're experiencing. Is it true guilt or is it false guilt? If it is over something that I could not have changed, that was beyond my freedom, yet I feel bad about it, yet I hate myself for it, that is false guilt. That is not true guilt. That is not true guilt. I may have to look for true guilt hiding behind the false guilt, because what true guilt is going to do is it's going to actually tell me to do something that I can do, that I do have the freedom for. So I'm better off looking for that. And as for the false guilt, I need to identify it for what it is and then not do what it is asking me to do. Making sense? I hope it is. Again, an entire subject in itself. All right. Any other? Do you want to challenge me more? Okay, thank you for this wonderful session. Means I should shut up and go home. Advice for younger students just makes me feel old. I'm not that much. Your advice to you is don't consider me to be too much older than yourselves. But seriously, yeah, I do have to start accepting my aging self, right? And start giving that wisdom of which I really don't have a lot of experience. Anywho, but what I will say is, as youngsters, right, we do tend to be very, 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 very cocksure of our conclusions, whether they're about life, about ourselves, about our parents. I'd advise caution there. It's good to be confident. It's good to be determined. It's good to be committed. But then when that borders on arrogance and rigidity, then you're just reenacting that same toxicity. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You might want to question that perception. Okay? How do we stop creating bad situations in our mind? By creating good ones. See, one of the consequences of being in toxic environments is that toxic thoughts and emotions become a gut response. They become a reflex. They're automatic. They're just happening without you being able to do much about them, right? And the more you try to fight them, thoughts are of the nature, the more you fight them, the more you grow. Anybody who has had any issues with obsessionality would know that. The way to deal with that is stop fighting them. And it's very difficult to stop fighting them and ignore them. So what you do is you channel yourself towards positive situations, positive thoughts. You consciously direct your attention towards that which is positive. Whether in terms of an environment, you get that environment. You read to create that environment inside of yourself. You hear and listen to stuff that will open you up to that positivity, right? And then you work towards it. You create that positive environment as much as you possibly can, and before you know it, the negativity has been taken care of. The bad situations in your head have been taken care of. I wish it was easy to accept where your guilt is coming from. We wish life was easy. But then what is it that it holds for us at the end? If we're able to make some sense of what that is, we would realize that the difficulty is worth it. That the difficulty is worth it. What about the fact that you have to live without that toxicity throughout your life? In case of sons, how one can endure it throughout his life? I don't think I understand the question. So a son is not subjected to that toxicity on account of being a son. And then when he goes into the real world, he actually has to bear that toxicity. Then how do they endure it? Is that what the question is? Stutter freak? Yes? No? Maybe? In relation to parents. I still don't get it. So my apologies to Stutter Freak. My hosts, can you please am I good to go? Is it okay if I wrap up and leave? Do you want to thank me? Do you want to give me a virtual shield? All right, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, people, thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. That's all from my side. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.